Today is the 11th of July 2018, and this is a conversation between Emilio Longo and Katherine Lack. Katherine, thank you for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Okay, fantastic. I would like to get straight into my questions. So, beginning from the top. Now, I would like to begin with your early childhood life. Now, I understand that you were born in Budapest, Hungary. Can you tell me a little about what it was like growing up there?
It's very difficult for me to think back that far.
I see, sure.
Just an ordinary childhood with my sister, my family,
Mm-hmm.
and very different from American life,
Mm-hmm.
very quiet
Sure.
and simple life.
A simple life, yes. And how many siblings do you have?
I had four siblings. They were all girls, and I was the oldest.
I see.
Two of my sisters passed away.
Okay, I'm sorry to hear that. Okay, now, along with your siblings and parents, you immigrated to the United States shortly after the end of World War II. What was this experience like for you?
We left Hungary in 1944,
I see.
about a month before the Russians surrounded Budapest.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went to Vienna. We stayed there for 3 months and then went to a little place in Austria and
Sure.
lived there until 1945.
Okay.
And we were refugees. We couldn't take very much with us, just what we could carry practically.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a very, very simple life.
I
There
see.
was nothing much to do. In
Mm-hmm.
Austria, we just did what everybody else did, which is exist.
Mm-hmm.
We got care packages from the United States,
Yes.
and we had all the food was rationed, and you couldn't get anything. In
Mm-hmm.
all the years I lived in Austria, I saw one egg.
Wow.
It's a little hard to understand, but that's the kind of life we had.
So it was a hard existence at that time.
Well, it wasn't really hard. We were in a very beautiful area.
Mm-hmm.
We were in a valley with a river and wild meadows and beautiful high mountains all around. And it was just that part of it was very rewarding, actually. And I was a child. I didn't have to worry,
Sure.
about the future or what's going to happen. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So, to my understanding, I know that you're an artist in your own right, and throughout your life you have crafted unique handmade jewelry. Did you attend an art or design school at some point
I
throughout your
went,
life?
I went in 1946 through some friends who let me know about this school. I went to Vienna
Mm-hmm.
and stayed there at this school, which was partly vocational school, partly an art and craft school.
Okay. And what did you study there?
We had a program of 2 years where we studied everything, including life drawing, fashion drawing, watercolor, and all kinds of designing, like designing fabrics, designing clothes,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
uh, calligraphy, all
Sure.
kinds of things. And after the 2 years, we had to pick a specialized class, and I went for enameling on copper.
Okay.
That was included. We also had to take jewelry classes to know how to prepare the metal
Okay.
and did the enameling. And so that's, in a way, it's an art that is very prevalent in Vienna. They do a lot of it.
Sure.
Anyway, went there until 1950, which is when
1950. Okay.
we left for the United States. My
Sure.
family.
Yes, absolutely. Now, did you have an interest in traditional art prior to meeting Richard Lack?
I will tell you that I did not have interest in any other kind of art.
Okay.
I've always been mostly just exposed to traditional art. We
Sure.
had in the school we were exposed to some of the French abstractionists like Braque and Picasso and Matisse. And that helped with jewelry design.
Yep.
But I never really considered it the kind of art that I considered fine art.
I see.
So that's how I felt at that time.
Sure. So the influence of modernism didn't really have a hold in the school that you attended?
Not the school. The school wasn't basically an art school. It was more a craft
Craft school.
and vocational. They learned how to do tailoring and sewing, so they would graduate to be masters.
Sure. Okay.
I would graduate to be a master enamelist, which was,
Fantastic.
it didn't have much to do with art. Then we came to this country, and I did some enameling on my own
Sure.
to try to sell some of the things that I did.
Okay. So moving forward, you would come to meet Mr. Lack in 1953 while he was training at R.H. Ives Gamel's summer studio in Provincetown, Cape Cod. Are you able to share your recollections on how you first met?
Yes, in Provincetown, which was a little resort at the time, everybody, after sundown, everybody walked and promenaded on the street.
I see.
And I met him on the street through some mutual acquaintances that we both ran into on the beach.
Okay.
So that was how we met.
Sure. So what was your conversation? Do you recall much of your conversation at that point?
Well, I remember one thing. He was pretty impressed that I knew who Mahler was.
Sorry, who's that?
Mahler, the composer.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yep. Sure.
And I was also we met on the 4th of July.
Oh, on the holiday, on the American holiday.
And it was very crowded, and we were in a group of people. Went to a nightclub, and then we went to a party, and then we went out to the beach because some people were shooting off fireworks.
I see.
So that's how we met.
Right. Now, at this point, was it love at first sight?
Not really. It was just, we just met. We just kept company.
Sure. So you were just friendly at that point?
Yes, we were in a group with several people. I was there with a very dear girlfriend from Pittsburgh, and we were doing enameling together.
Okay.
And that's why I was there.
I see.
Studying, and so he was very busy every day from 9 to 5 in the afternoon.
That's right. And
because he was a redhead, he did not like to be on the beach very much.
I see.
It was good for him to have a lot of sun.
That's right. Sure. And at that point in time, what was your age and what was the age of Mr. Lack?
I was 23 and he was 25.
Okay, great. So it wasn't too much of an age difference between you?
No.
Okay. Now, I've come to learn that Mr. Lack was a very well-mannered gentleman. What was Mr. Lack's personality like? Did he have a sense of humour? Was he serious? Did he enjoy socialising? Or was he introverted?
He was very introverted generally. But in Provincetown, after a drink or two, he was pretty open and very friendly and talking to different people.
Sure.
So, but you have to be kind of introverted when you're a painter.
That's right.
Because you're mostly working alone.
That's correct. Yes. So what was much of his conversation?
He was very polite.
He was very polite. Yes, I've come to understand that.
Yes.
So what was much of his conversation based around when you were talking in those early years?
Well, he was certainly acquainting me with what it's like to be a painter.
Sure.
And he was afraid in the beginning to show me his paintings.
Okay.
And I was afraid to look.
Okay.
And was because in Provincetown, everybody who was there, not everybody, but about 80% of the people were artists, and they did all kinds of arts and crafts. And so I was afraid to see what he did because I couldn't relate to any of that abstract stuff that they did.
Absolutely, sure.
Finally, toward the end of our stay, my friend and I stayed in Provincetown 3 months.
Okay.
And Richard and the Gamal people stayed there, well, until Labor Day. Mm-hmm. And so toward the end of the time, he finally said, well, maybe you better come up to the studio. By that time, we felt really warm toward each other. So I went up to the studio and I looked. He was painting a 14-year-old girl's portrait.
Okay.
And all I could say is, it's so beautiful. Mm-hmm. And that was my first impression, and I always remember that because all the paintings he did, he was always focusing on the beauty of the painting.
Sure, absolutely. Okay.
So that made me very comfortable. It made him very comfortable.
Good, fantastic. Now, at this point, did you think that Mr. Lack would come to be the man you would be married to for 54 years?
No. Just don't do that,
Sure. Okay. During this time, what information did Mr. Lack share with you regarding his experiences training with Gamal?
Well, he was very complimentary because Gamal was offering the kind of information that he was looking for.
Sure.
And so he appreciated everything. And the one thing Gamal made his students do is be very, very disciplined.
Sure.
They had to be at the studio and working by 9 o'clock in the morning, no matter what.
Wow.
And they had to really stick to it, in the afternoon. Usually when they were in Boston, they always had life drawing in the morning, and then they had their own work in the afternoon, starting with still lifes, and then later set up portraits and interior. And
mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have seen some of Richard's early work, but
yes.
Some of it was done in the studio.
Absolutely.
Do you have that book of the catalog raisonné?
Most definitely, yes, I do.
So you can kind of see the early works.
Yes, I've seen those. Those are lovely, lovely works.
And the one thing that was so important is that they are very disciplined and they clean their palette every night,
mm-hmm.
which a lot of painters never do.
That's right, yeah.
So that was very important, and I was very happy with that.
So how many students at the time did Gamal have? This is in Provincetown.
He had in Provincetown, he was only there in the summer for
That's
2
right.
months.
For 2 months.
And then he had the studio in Boston.
Sure, that's right. Okay.
And Richard studied in Boston until 56.
That's correct, yes. Okay. So, going back to Provincetown for a moment, how did you maintain contact after Mr. Lack finished his training with Gamal in Provincetown?
Well, I went back to Pittsburgh and he went back to Boston, and we wrote letters.
Mm-hmm.
And then he came through on the train through Pittsburgh to visit his parents in California.
Okay.
He stopped by and he visited and he met my parents. And by that time, we kind of knew that we liked each other a lot.
Yes.
So then the next year, in 1954, I moved to Boston.
I see. Okay. Now, whilst training with Mr. Gamal, Mr. Lack began teaching at Vesper George School of Art in Boston. At this time, did he share any experiences on what it was like teaching in this school?
Well, he taught some people who were not necessarily going to be painters. They just wanted to study some art and learn a little drawing.
Sure.
And he didn't share too much except a couple anecdotes on
Hmm.
and off. He didn't consider it very important as far as art was, his own art or development was concerned. He mostly did it because he needed a little bit of extra income.
Yeah, sure, sure. Okay. He would also come to teach at art instruction schools, which, to my understanding, was a school that taught art through mail correspondence. Did this
Right.
school's faculty respond well to his traditional training?
Well, they welcomed anybody who knew how to draw because that's what they were trying to teach.
Good. Okay.
So, that's a good way of putting what they appreciated. And he had some friends who worked at art instruction. And when we came to Minneapolis, which incidentally was where he's from, and his parents lived here
Mm-hmm.
after they moved back from California. And
Yes.
he art instruction was something that was very happy to give him a job.
I see.
He first applied to the art school,
Mm-hmm.
the one art school where he actually started the Minneapolis School of Art.
Yes.
Started there, but he didn't get anything out of what they taught, so that's why he went to New York and Boston.
Sure.
But he went there and he thought, well, he'll try and apply and maybe he can teach there. And they told him they didn't think he would be happy there.
That's right. I recall hearing that. Yes.
So he taught at art instruction, but not only full time, only for a year.
That's right. And then he reduced. He reduced his days, right?
Built his studio.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When we moved to Minneapolis, then the next year we found a place that was a basement, and he wanted to have a studio, and so he built the studio more or less by himself
Sure.
with help from some friends.
Okay.
Then he started. He already got a couple of portrait commissions, and he did some landscape sketches that people loved and bought. So it worked out.
Sure. Okay. Now, just going back for a moment to 1955. Now, in 1955, Mr. Lack travelled to Europe to study the work of the Flemish Baroque master Peter Paul Rubens, an artist which he greatly admired for his style and method. Now, what was it about Rubens' work in particular that captivated Mr. Lack?
Well, he studied many different old masters, not just Rubens, but Rubens was his ideal. And I have the feeling that his personality was similar to Rubens because he enjoyed the same kind of luscious paint,
Okay. Sure. Yes.
the handling, he enjoyed the luminosity of the flesh tones that Rubens achieved.
Sure. Sure.
So he was very impressed with that.
Okay.
And yes, he spent 3 months in Europe.
Sure. Okay, good. Now, shortly after returning from Europe, Mr. Lack and yourself were married. Do you recall the day that he proposed to you?
He asked me before he went to Europe. I think he
Oh.
was afraid I'd run off somewhere.
Do you recall much from that particular day that he proposed?
Well, we kind of knew that we were probably going to stay together, and he was very formal about it, which I considered not very important, but he was very formal about it. And so he asked me to marry him, and I said, sure,
Mm-hmm.
yes, and then he went off to Europe for 3 months.
Sure, okay. Was it important that Mr. Lack asked your father's permission before proposing?
No, he didn't ask my father or my mother.
Okay, okay, fine.
People,
Sorry, go on.
people just didn't do that anymore in those days.
Is that right? Okay, interesting. Now, my next question, you've already touched on that a little bit. So, do you believe something that Mr. Lack encountered in Europe prompted his proposal, but you mentioned that he proposed before going to Europe?
Yes.
That's right. Okay, so we can move on from that question. So next question, are you able to provide details about your wedding day? For instance, where did the wedding take place and who joined you for the ceremony?
Well, my parents lived in Pittsburgh.
Sure.
I was Catholic, and Richard was brought up Lutheran.
That's right.
So we had to go through a little bit of counseling, and somehow it didn't seem very important. It was more important that we get over it and get married.
Sure.
And we got married in a Catholic church by a Catholic priest.
Okay.
And but only immediate family was there.
I see. Sure. And did you have a ceremony afterward?
No.
Okay, so no celebration or reception or anything like that?
We had a big party before.
Oh,
Because
before. Okay.
my parents had a circle of friends, Hungarian friends who were immigrants, Pittsburgh, and my sister married the year before, and she had a big reception. And these friends of my parents said, well, you can't have no reception for your other daughter. So my parents gave a party, but that was before the wedding.
Before the wedding. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure, that makes sense. Now, moving forward, in 1957, Mr. Lack and yourself returned to Minneapolis and purchased a home in Glen Lake, where you built
Yes.
a studio which was based on the lighting conditions recommended in the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci. Now, to my understanding, the studio was rectangular in shape, with north-facing skylights and a 45-degree angled ceiling.
I don't know who said that about Leonardo da Vinci. I never heard that part.
Okay.
I know that we had a space on one end of the house that was 25 by 20 feet.
Right.
And Richard did a little cardboard model to the same proportion and tried to figure out the angle of light that came in through the roof, and figured out what angle light the old masters used.
Sure.
And so he experimented with that for a while and figured out finally that 45 degrees is the best light.
Okay, I see.
So that's why then he built the studio so that the north roof was 45 degrees.
I see. Okay. And can you explain a little about the experience of building the studio?
Yes, we had a daughter who was about 8 months old, and she was in a playpen in the yard watching it. And, it was just a lot of work. I remember Richard came home. At that time, he worked part-time at art instruction.
Sure.
He came home one evening, and he said he came into the driveway, and the lumber yard delivered all the lumber.
Okay.
And he looked at it and he said, well, he was petrified. It looked like something impossible to do. But then he had some help with friend Don Kessner, who was a friend from art school. And he already built his own cabin and everything. So he knew how to build things. And
yes.
So they got started, and we have a lot of photographs of just how it progressed slowly.
And how long did the actual process of building the studio take?
Well, it took that summer of 59.
So just one summer? Wow.
Yes, and in the fall, the studio was all closed in.
Okay.
We were doing the insulation, and then in October, he got a commission of the Kennedy portraits.
Yes.
So he painted the portrait in an unfinished studio, but the light was good. And
wow.
I mean, those were posthumous portraits,
yes.
So it mattered too much. But he had good light to figure out how to do it. So.
Sure. Now, that's interesting that you mentioned the Kennedy portraits and that they were posthumous portraits. So I'm guessing then, of course, he would have had to work from photographic reproductions?
Yes. He did sketches in Boston for the Kennedy family
Okay.
and asked him to do the portraits. And I'm not sure if I don't think he did any in Boston. I think he did the first ones right in his unfinished studio.
Okay, I see.
So
Wow. Okay. Now, going back to Mr. Lack's studio, can you tell me a little bit about how the interior of the studio was set up?
well, it depended on what we had. We didn't have much. We had a sort of a folding bed and
Mm-hmm.
we old dresser that somebody gave us, and so he used that for paints, grinding paints.
Of course, yes.
His friend Don did all his own paints, and so Richard started grinding his own paints, let me tell you, it was pretty messy,
Of course, yes.
especially the alizarin crimson.
I can imagine, yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, we had somebody, and I don't know where he got it from, but there was a mannequin
Mm-hmm.
that he got, whom we named Marilyn. And I had to fill out the body with foam rubber so that it can be clothed in case he needed it.
Of course, yeah.
And when he started painting portraits, it was very handy because he could dress it in the clothes, so the sitters didn't have to sit there.
That's right.
While he did the clothes.
That's right. Fantastic. Okay, so once the studio was built, what was Mr. Lack's daily work routine? For example, did he paint every day for how many hours? And did you often keep him company in the studio?
Absolutely, he painted every day.
Wow.
He painted from 9 to 12, and then he took some time off. We would have lunch, and then he would maybe relax for half an hour, and then he would go back to paint.
Wow.
And he usually till 3, 4 o'clock, depending on the light.
Of
In the
course.
winter, by 4 o'clock, it was bad light, so then he
Sure.
couldn't do it anymore.
Of course. Now,
So
go on.
that's started working on etchings.
Of course, yes.
Because in the evening, then he had a drawing board and he had a light. He purchased an etching press and he worked on etchings in the evenings
Of course.
and on sketches for other paintings.
Sure, of course. Now, was he working 7 days a week?
Yes, mostly.
Wow.
There were times when we had plans, and like the 4th of July, we'd have a picnic, and there were times when we went on vacation. And at Thanksgiving, he tiled the bathroom, for instance, so he did other things.
Sure.
Over the years, he built a fence, he built an arbor, a shed.
Mm-hmm.
We did a lot of gardening,
Yep.
and he could always partake. And in the summer, after he got done painting, when he did studio work,
Yep.
then we went to the lake, and the whole family, we went to the lake and had a swim and enjoyed the weather.
Sure. Okay.
Warm.
Lovely. Now, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say in the winter, though, he did stay mostly and did work in the evening.
Absolutely. Sure.
He did things like stretching the canvases, and then later on we would make frames.
That's right. Frame making. Absolutely. Yeah.
And he had several paintings, and the frames have become so expensive you couldn't afford them
Yes.
So we started making our own.
Absolutely. Okay. Go on.
There was a whole system. He had a friend who was a wood carver, and he had him carve some ornaments according to old designs that were then made into ornaments that could be applied to the moldings, the original wood moldings. And after they were applied, we had to do that all ourselves. We had to heat those
Wow.
and put them on, and then gesso and paint and varnish and gild and all the rest of it. It's a lot of work, but it
Wow.
was. I enjoyed doing part of that too.
Of course, and I can imagine you would have been quite good at that due to your craft background.
Well, I enjoyed doing it. I learned how to do it, and
Sure.
nice.
Good. Now, you mentioned that whilst Mr. Lack would be painting in his studio, he would often take time off at about 12 o'clock and have lunch and just sit with you for a moment. What would he often talk about during those conversations? Was it mainly based on his painting in the studio, or would he change subject to
No,
focus on something else?
part of the time I wasn't there because I was working as a freelance artist.
Yes,
So whenever in later years I wasn't there at lunchtime.
I see. I see. Okay.
He
Did
had
you?
a
Sorry.
whom he had a friend later in later years, like in the 80s. He had a friend, Gary Christensen, who
Yes.
did that book.
Of course.
He would come over and have lunch with Richard almost every day,
Wow. What a
which was
privilege.
nice. And he has a whole set of tapes from their conversation, and I was not.
Wow. I didn't realize that he actually recorded all those conversations, did he?
He did. He recorded. He has a whole box full of tapes.
That's fascinating. Just fascinating. Did you often keep Mr. Lack company whilst he was painting in the studio at any point?
In the beginning, I posed for a lot of studies, and when he was starting to establish the designs on a painting, he
Wow.
needed somebody, to be there
Of
to
course.
it looked like and everything. So I posed for him for several paintings, and
Okay.
and
I've definitely seen some of you, some of the works that he's painted of you, considering the Italian hat, lovely
that was
portrait.
Boston. That was the first one. We
Yes,
were married then.
that's a lovely, lovely portrait of you.
Yeah, but he has a couple paintings that I'm in. One of them is the one that's owned by the Maryhill Museum. It looks like it looks a little like Whistler's mother.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Anyway, then after a while, I was making more money per hour than he would have to pay the models. So I said, no. I said, you pay models now because I make more money than. Well, we had to, really skimp. We didn't have much of an income.
Of
He
course.
taught, he taught, and through art instruction, a lot of people asked him to start teaching some evenings so they could learn how to draw better.
Sure.
So that's how he started to teach.
Of course. Okay. Now, regarding Mr. Lack's painting process, did he work on one painting at a time or did he work on multiple?
Mostly he had several going, but just because some were portraits, and then he had to wait for the sitter.
Mm-hmm.
And some were imaginative paintings where he had a lot of sketches that he had to work on, and he worked on studies for them.
Of course.
And then occasionally, especially in the summer, he would set up a still life or two
Yes.
because he loved to paint flowers.
Yes, of course.
We raised peonies, and he painted, I think, a peony a year for about 10 years.
Wow.
And so he had, in the summer, it was a little different. He would have a sitter, maybe. He would work on studies, but mostly he would work on landscapes.
That's right. Yes.
And the landscapes sort of cut into the family life because they had to be done when the weather is right.
That's right.
So sometimes we didn't have dinner. I maybe had dinner with the children, but he was out landscape painting.
Of course.
Depends on the time of day and the weather and everything else. It's a very, very different kind of life when you depend on the weather that much.
That's right, absolutely. So, to my understanding, Mr. Lack's body of work, as he worked in many genres, it was really a seasonal thing. It depended, like in the summers, it would be focused on landscape. In the winter, it was more studio work, the still life, the figurative work. Is that correct?
Yes, it sounds correct. He did some of the figurative work in the summer also, but he enjoyed painting landscapes a lot.
Absolutely, yes, that's right. And landscape does take up a substantial amount of his body of work. If we look at Richard's complete body
Yeah.
of work, yeah,
He has a lot of
a
landscapes.
lot of landscapes, yes. Okay, now one thing I want to touch on as well, Catherine, was you mentioned that during the winters when the light wasn't so good, that Mr. Lack would turn to etchings, and I understand he also made woodcuts.
Yes.
Now, that's interesting because today I don't see a lot of artists who call themselves classical realists that are working in that particular medium, in etching and woodcut. It seems something that wasn't really carried forward. Do you know why this is so?
No, I don't.
Okay.
And I do know that some people work in etching and in woodcuts.
Yes.
They're maybe not part of what they would call classical realists.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And they're actually very nice.
Yeah.
And they even do colored etchings, which
Yeah.
is very difficult. He tried to do colored etchings, and we tried, with my experience as a commercial artist, I knew how to register things.
Of course, yes.
I tried to do those prints, but the paper had to be wet, and it stretched, and then it shrank,
Yes.
and it was just very, very complicated, and we never could figure it out. He spent a few weeks on it, but not too much. He was more interested in doing his large paintings.
Of course. Great. Now, regarding Mr. Lack's process, back to Mr. Lack's process. Now, did Mr. Lack stand or sit whilst at the easel?
Well, if you do like painting still lifes, interiors, or portraits, you have to stand because you have to walk back and forth.
Of course.
Working side to side. So what you do is you set up things right next to the easel.
Mm-hmm.
You walk a certain distance and look at it, and then you go close and paint, and then you go walk back again and look at it, and then you walk forward again and paint. And
Absolutely. Yes.
so he stand.
Absolutely. The side-size approach definitely requires the artist to stand.
Absolutely, because and you have to walk around. I mean, you have to go back to see what you're doing, and then you have to go forward and do it.
Of course. That's
So
right.
it's a certain way of doing it, and that's good. It keeps you in shape.
Very nice. Now, did Mr. Lack work in silence or did he listen to music whilst painting?
He listened to music. He talked to his sitters. And sometimes he even listened to talking books later.
Oh, okay.
And no, he listened mostly to music. Now, what's not mentioned is he played the violin, and he played in an orchestra for
That's
10
right.
years. And he practiced a lot after he got done painting, especially in the winter.
Yes, of course. Now, in regards to the music that Mr. Lack would listen to whilst painting, what kind of music was it?
Oh, it was always classical music.
Of course, absolutely. Okay. Now, moving forward, I understand that you would often give Mr. Lack critiques of his works. I assume he was open with you regarding his struggles in the studio?
Well, he would ask me to come up and take a look at what he did.
Yes.
And sometimes I'd say, oh, okay. And sometimes when I went up there at the end of the day, he said, now don't tell me anything because I'm tired.
Okay.
So I sometimes saw things that weren't quite right. You know, he had a big mirror standing behind him where he
Yes.
could look at the painting in the mirror.
Absolutely.
Because he said you can tell some things if they aren't right.
Absolutely.
So that helped him a lot. And I didn't really critique. I just Well, I made some suggestions sometimes.
Of course.
I developed pretty well a good eye. He taught me how to look at things, and it helped him some.
Of course. And I imagine just having that fresh pair of eyes would have been a great asset to Mr. Lack.
Very important to have a fresh eye. And sometimes he would put a painting aside for a week and not look at it. And
Wow.
then he'd pull it out and look at it. And he would sometimes study one of his paintings for as long as an hour, maybe. Just sit and
Wow.
study it because he wanted to. And that's what he did in the early years. He would look at old master books after everybody went to bed. He would stay up and look at old master paintings and just study them, study
Incredible.
the design, study the light.
What an incredible work ethic.
Well, it's a lot of work, but it paid off. I mean, his work
Absolutely.
very solid
That's correct. Yes.
and very beautiful.
I agree. Now, were there any rituals that Mr. Lack had whilst he was in the studio?
Well, I don't think you had. I don't think there were any rituals.
Sure. Okay.
I don't know exactly what you mean.
Well, I suppose, were there any things that Mr. Lack would do in order to get into the state or mode to begin painting?
No, you don't need to. I mean, it's work, you know. He knew that it was work and he just started in. It wasn't like he had to be inspired.
So he was able to just go from, say, being in the kitchen, having a conversation with you, to entering the studio and just be on and start painting.
Absolutely.
Wow, that's really something. Okay.
Well, because people have this idea that painters have to be inspired. He was inspired a lot, but his inspiration was in all the sketches that he did, usually in the evenings when he was alone in the studio and he relaxed and he had all these ideas. He worked on a lot of sketches and ideas and conceptions of things he wanted to express.
Of course, yes, absolutely. And they were often done with chalk on toned paper, is that correct?
A lot of them are on paper.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Now, how about any idiosyncrasies? Did he have any sayings or actions that would frustrate or maybe humor you?
No,
No? Okay, that's fine. Did anything ever prohibit Mr. Lack from being in his studio?
no, except when he was ill. But even then, he'd rather lie down in the studio and look at paint, look at his work. So no, he was pretty much. It was always first priority to
Wow,
be in the studio and to pay attention to painting.
incredible. Did he often put things off in order to just focus purely on painting?
Well, what do you mean by putting off? He didn't have anything else set up. And when it was something that came up, like a family outing, or in the evenings we went to theater and concerts and opera, and you know, that didn't stop him. It was just another part of life.
Okay, really interesting. So he was interested in theatre and opera as well.
Oh, everything.
Great, great.
Very, very multifaceted.
Of course, yes. Okay, moving forward, did you ever find that Mr. Lack had to get away from art and teaching and simply just have a break?
Yes, we went on vacations.
Yes.
And sometimes he took one of his sons fishing for a few days. In Minnesota, fishing is it. You know, everybody does it.
Okay.
Not everybody, but a lot of people.
Sure, sure, absolutely.
And yes, we went on vacations, and sometimes we went out and had a picnic somewhere by a lake nearby, whatever.
Yes, absolutely. Now, did those outings inspire much of Mr. Lack's paintings?
Probably not.
Okay, interesting.
He had to get away. Probably that was a good thing.
Yes, yeah.
And in later years, he had a dog, and he would walk every morning several miles.
Wow. Okay, good.
That was very good.
Absolutely. Good. Now, I understand Mr. Lack was quite the scholar and was very well read. How did his readings fit into his busy painting schedule?
Well, there's a lot of time in the evening when you can just read,
Of course. Yep.
and when the light is bad, that's always when he read.
Sure.
When
Sure.
he did, when he didn't practice music, then he would read a book, or
Great.
that's
Now,
about.
yes, sure. Now, I recall reading that he would often stay up until the early hours of the morning. In fact, you mentioned that previously, and often
That
he would study the books on the old master's techniques. So, can you just elaborate a little bit more on that?
it was just in the beginning, few years, 2, 3 years in the beginning when we moved here and had a house.
Okay.
After he didn't do that.
Okay,
I
so you
mean,
just done it in the beginning.
when we had the children, he would read them stories before bedtime, and then he would go to the studio and read, or stay in the living room and read, but he wouldn't stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning.
Okay, I see. I see. Sure. Now, was the majority of his reading based on art books and subjects of art, or did he read other subjects?
Uh, we read some interesting books like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin,
Okay.
and of course Carl Jung,
Yes, absolutely.
and a lot of books that were more classics.
Yes, of course. Okay, interesting. Do you know at what point in his life that Carl Jung really influenced Mr. Lack?
Gamel was influenced by Jung. He
Yes,
painted a whole series of paintings because of Jung.
that's right.
And so Richard was always aware that there was this man, and then he read one of Jung's books, and I think it said "Modern Man in Search of a Soul." I mean,
Okay.
we both read it, and he was fascinated by the idea that Jung seemed to harmonize with his own ideas about the world and how to look at it. And so we started reading and started getting involved in the Minnesota Jung Association,
Yes, yep,
and did a lot of not work, but lectures and discussions and studies, actually,
okay.
and and read a lot of Jungian books, and that partly inspired him to paint all those large paintings. He wanted to
Yes,
depict somehow the journey of
that's
individuation.
right. Yes.
It's practically impossible to do, but people have to understand what it's all about when they look at the paintings before they see what he is trying to do.
Sure,
But
sure.
he was very involved in that.
Interesting. That's really, really interesting. Now, that process of individualization that you mentioned, that was basically Jung's idea of the individual becoming psychologically whole. Is that correct?
Yes, the individual becoming well-rounded,
Well-rounded, sure.
so that it deals with all parts of himself and all parts of what's happening to him. Instead of ignoring some and going off in a comfortable direction,
Sure.
what you do is you try to look at the uncomfortable things and try to deal with them and make it your own and become comfortable with who you are.
Great. That's a great philosophy to live by.
Well, it's certainly, we both responded to that.
Sure, sure. Now, was it at this point that Mr. Lack rejected his Lutheran upbringing?
I don't think he ever really dealt with the Lutheran upbringing. It was just he didn't ever mention it.
Okay, sure. Okay, good. Now, moving forward, did you find that Mr. Lack's work changed at all once he became a father?
No,
Okay. Did
his
that
life, his life might have changed a little bit, but not his work.
not his work? Okay, interesting. Did you find that a lot of your children would become subject matter for Mr. Lack's paintings?
Oh yes, he enjoyed having them around so
That's
that
sure. Yeah,
he
sure.
did a lot of sketches when they were little, and
Great.
Susanna especially posed a lot,
Yeah, I've seen lovely portraits of
and Michael
Susanna.
did too.
Yeah,
Peter did a little less, but he did too. He posed,
sure, sure.
and
Interesting. Now, in 1967, Mr. Lack wrote on the training of painters, which took the form of an essay that highlighted the teaching of art based on what Gamel had put forward in his book, Twilight of Painting. In total, how long did Mr. Lack take to complete on the training of painters?
I don't know, maybe a month.
Wow, only 1 month.
Well, it was something he knew how to do, so it was easy to write it down.
Sure. So, can you elaborate a little bit, Catherine? Exactly what was he trying to explain in on the training of painters?
As far as I know, it's the steps it takes to become proficient in drawing by seeing a certain way. In other words, you develop your eye.
Yes. Okay.
So they start by painting the casts, and then painting still first drawing a cast, and life drawing is always essential.
Yep.
And then starting to paint a cast and paint still lives, and then eventually paint people.
Sure, sure. Great. Now, to your knowledge, did Mr. Lack face any struggles with the whole process of writing on a training of painters?
You mean with writing it?
Well, with the process of writing it and getting all the information together, were there any struggles, or did it all come naturally to Mr. Lack?
Well, he was trained by Gamel a certain way, and he just explained that.
Sure. So he just put Gamel's teaching into his own words.
Mostly, yes.
Okay. Do you think that he added anything in addition to what Gamel had put forward?
I'm sure he did.
Sure. Sure.
But I'm not a painter, so I didn't get into all that detail that much.
Okay, that's fair enough.
From the way he talked, he went way past what Gamel taught him.
Sure, sure.
Especially in the way of impressionistic paintings.
Of course, yes, absolutely. Okay, now at about this time, Mr. Lack was approached by Thomas Mars, who asked for training. Now, Mars would become Mr. Lack's first full-time student. What was the relationship like between Mars and Mr. Lack?
Well, Tommy's mother brought him over, and Tommy was 14.
Wow, okay. So he's young, very young.
So Richard said, well, he can work here in part of my studio. I'll set up a cast for him and see how he can do.
Sure.
And so his mother drove him over. They lived in St. Paul, and so it was quite a drive each day.
Mm-hmm.
And he came over, and he worked in the studio, and he was just a school kid, actually.
Yeah, sure, at that age, yeah.
And that's how it worked. I don't remember what work he did. I know that he was working up there, trying to draw a cast, and
Okay.
and Richard was there telling him what to do. So
how did Thomas actually come to find Mr. Lack?
Well, somebody had a little gallery in St. Paul, and at that time Richard had some paintings, small landscape studies and things like that, and he wanted to sell some. And somebody suggested try this gallery.
Mm-hmm.
So he went over there, and the gallery owner put two of his landscapes in there, and Tommy's mother saw them and said, "Oh, who is that? Who did that?"
Yeah.
That's how she knew about Richard.
Okay, I see. I
She
see.
came over with Tommy, and that's how it started.
Sure. Okay. Now you mentioned that you didn't really know too much about what Mr. Ma's training involved with Mr. Lack. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know very much about it. It didn't last very long.
I see. Right.
He was there for a while, and then after a while, I don't think he was there.
Sure. Okay.
But
Now,
by that time, Richard was interested in teaching some people seriously.
that's right.
So
Interesting. Very interesting.
we can lead that into how he was started.
Yes, absolutely. Now, regarding Mr. Mars, I understand that he's no longer with us. Is that right?
No,
Yeah.
no, he passed away quite a few years ago.
Okay. Yep. Sure. Okay. Well, moving forward. In 1969, Mr. Lack and yourself founded Atelier Lack in effort to preserve and pass on the knowledge that Mr. Lack had gained from his training with Gamel. Atelier Lack would become a critical link to the 19th century Western European academic tradition as well as 20th century Boston Impressionism. For 22 years, and with a total enrollment of 96 full-time students from around the country, Atelier Lack trained some of the most accomplished and sought-after classical realist painters of the time. Atelier Lack has become a model for many studio schools that have been established today, and therefore Mr. Lack is now considered the father of the contemporary atelier movement. Now, in lead up to Atelier Lack opening, did Mr. Lack often talk about beginning his own school?
Who are you quoting with that?
Well, with this, I've actually got it from research from books and off of the internet as well. Now, if I was to be correct in saying who am I quoting exactly, where did I get the information from? It was in one of Stephen Jerton's articles.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what happened is Richard taught these friends in the evenings, and then he wanted to maybe train some serious painters, so he considered getting a studio somewhere, renting a place, and trying to, having a couple students.
Mm-hmm.
Which he started, and it was a very difficult start. It was very difficult to find a place,
Mm-hmm.
to rent, not very expensive either,
Mm-hmm.
and to get the right lighting.
Mm-hmm.
Had to purchase a skylight and had it put in the ceiling. And the first few students were not very, shall we say, disciplined. Yes,
of course.
Nobody really knew what it was like.
Mm-hmm.
It had some difficult starts.
I can imagine, sure.
After a while, then he finally found Steve.
Mm-hmm.
Steve came over with a painting to the studio, and I remember Richard talked to him for a while, and then he called me upstairs. I happened to be home.
Mm-hmm.
Said, "Take a look at this." And Steve had this huge painting of the Alamo.
Sure.
With about, 18 figures or something.
Wow.
So Richard was very impressed.
I can imagine he would have been, yes.
It was very difficult to find a place. That was always the hardest part of finding, of starting to teach, is to find appropriate studio.
Sure. Right.
And each time he found one, he had to put in a skylight.
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
Because lighting was never correct, and so under the skylight, that's where they did life drawing.
Yes, of course.
And set up portraits also.
Sure. Now,
eventually.
Of course, yes. So before actually the process of establishing Atelier Lack occurred, would Mr. Lack ever mention to you plans or vision that he had for one day establishing a school that was patterned after the model of the 19th century French atelier system?
Well, he knew that that's the way to teach.
Sure. Yeah.
He knew that if he was going to teach seriously, that's the way he would like to do it.
Absolutely.
And so the main thing was to establish some kind of a curriculum, deal with the students. And
Yes.
it always depended on the kind of students he had.
Of course.
It was hard to find students with the right mindset in the beginning.
Yes.
People who thought it's an art school, they thought it would be like any other art school. They could do whatever they wanted. And a lot of people did. And so Richard said, no, you don't belong in here.
That's right.
So it was a difficult beginning.
I can imagine. Now, how long in total did it take to get the school up and running?
I can't say it's up and running.
Okay.
What happened is he had 2 or 3 students. Some of them worked fine and one of them didn't. And so he just went in there a couple times and he explained to them what he wanted them to do, and it was hard. And then we had a friend who had an uncle who was a retired lawyer.
Okay.
And he said, if you're going to teach, he said, I'm going to set you up as a nonprofit.
Okay.
And that really helped, and it helps them today at the atelier.
Yes, of course, yes.
They're still the same nonprofit organization, so they can do a lot of things that other schools can't.
Wow, that's really something.
So
go on.
I think it was incorporated in 1971.
71, okay.
And by that time, I think Steve and Annette they came pretty soon.
Yes.
And Gary Hoffman and Alan Banks, Tom Mars, a couple other people. So he had a handful of students.
Interesting. Now, take me through the actual interview process. I mean, was there an interview process? If I'm a new student and I'm coming to find Richard Lack and I want to create work in this tradition, what was the actual interview process like?
The interview what?
The interview process. How would I become a student at Atelier Lack?
Well, he would talk to the people and see their work, talk to them and explain the discipline. And if they said, this is what I want, which not too many would say.
Yes.
Especially after they tried it.
Oh, yes, of course.
So it was just all individual.
Sure.
Each person, depending on what they wanted, who they were, how old they were, and their work, what it looked like. So it was just that way. He had to talk to everybody in a very, very personal and individual way.
Sure. Okay. Would Mr. Lack often refuse to take on students?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting.
Yes. Had to.
And that was because their vision wasn't aligned to his. Is that correct?
Well, it just, he knew that they weren't going to work out.
Sure.
Just didn't have the right attitude toward art, which Richard took very seriously. The discipline of art,
of course,
was a very important thing to him. It wasn't something where you just come in and play when you feel like it.
Absolutely. And
a lot of people, especially in those days, which was in the 60s and 70s, a lot of people thought that was what art was. It was something they can play at. That's
right. Now, in regards to the actual meeting that students would have with Mr. Lack, did that occur in the actual atelier or at Mr. Lack's home studio?
Mostly, once the atelier was established, mostly it was the atelier.
Okay, sure.
In the beginning, though, it was in the studio.
Yes, of course, of course. Were there often times that you would have students just showing up at your door and knocking and asking to meet Mr. Lack and to talk to him about what he's got going on?
Uh, some people would call on the telephone and say, "Could I come and see you?" And then he would talk to them a little bit, and he said, "Sure, come and see me." A lot of them didn't work out.
Okay, that's interesting. That's really, really interesting. Now, going back to Atelier Lack, what were some of your duties at the school?
I didn't have any.
Okay, that's interesting.
In the beginning, I wasn't. I think you talked to Annette a lot because she has her own ideas about things.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really become part of the atelier till the mid '80s when I
Okay.
took over the I helped with the office work.
Yes.
I, I I did help to set up the accounting system
Okay. Interesting.
in the beginning. Not that I knew how, but it was just a matter of common sense.
Yes.
I had it checked with somebody who ran the accounting at the Art Institute.
I see.
He came over and I showed him what I was doing. And he said, "You're doing perfectly well. You don't need to do anything else." Because I don't even know how to do bookkeeping.
Sure. Okay, that's interesting. So you really learnt as you went.
Well, I just decided this is how we can set it up.
Yes. Yep.
And then we also had classes in the evening.
I see.
And that was, it helped, it helped, it helped with a little income that Richard had because he didn't charge his students anything.
Wow.
We just had to, pay the rent and the models. He charged, I think, model fees,
That's
but he
right.
didn't. He didn't charge tuition because Gamel never had to. Gamel had an independent income.
That's right. That's right.
We didn't have independent income, so Richard made his living other ways, and with the evening classes that helped.
Sure.
And sometimes he didn't want to do the evening classes, but
Okay.
actually people came and wanted to learn. And I said, "You need the evening classes because you have to educate disciples."
That's great. It's great that you mentioned that.
In those days, you had to do that because people didn't know what he was doing.
Absolutely.
They
Sure.
didn't want to know.
That's right. That's right. Uh, it's interesting. So you mentioned that Richard didn't actually charge his students fees, but he charged model fees, and he also, to my understanding, charged material fees. Is that correct?
Well, he didn't. He didn't provide any materials.
That's right. So students had to bring their own materials.
Oh, yeah.
Great, great. Now, I have read in another context that if it weren't for you, there wouldn't have been an Atelier Lack. What is your response to this?
I think that's Annette's fantasy.
So, in other words, you don't agree with it?
No.
Okay, interesting. Now, my next question. I imagine that there would have been many setbacks along the way. Would you like to share some of the adversities that Mr. Lack and yourself experienced during this time?
Well, in those days, some of the students had problem with drugs.
Okay,
That probably turned, it. He had to stop. He can't. He couldn't work with them.
sure, I see.
And other students did not take well to discipline.
Of course,
And Richard thought art was something that had to be disciplined or approached
of course.
with a serious mind and not be playful. And in those days, a lot of people thought of art as something you play at.
Yes, absolutely. Of course.
And he didn't believe that. He took it seriously, and it was a discipline and it was a craft.
That's
It
right.
had to be learned step by step so he could really teach people who would learn how to see.
Sure, sure. Great. Now, I understand at one point a fire occurred in the atelier. So, can you take me back to that time? How did the actual fire start?
There was a ballet school underneath the atelier, and somehow, and I really don't remember. Steve would know more about that.
Sure.
I don't know how it started. I
Okay.
know that a lot of the studio space burned upstairs.
Yes, absolutely.
We and in fact, Richard had a couple of paintings up there to show the students. One of them was a copy he made,
Hmm.
and that got burned.
Yeah. A lot of
And
student work was
some of them were
damaged. Yeah, to my understanding.
damaged. Yeah. I
Yeah.
don't know, but anyway, Steve and Annette were students at that time, and they were just desperate. They were saying, "Oh, now the atelier is gone. We're not going to have any possibilities of redoing it." So then Richard went to work and really tried to find a space, another space that would work.
That's interesting. Now, you mentioned that the school at that time was below the school was a ballet studio. Now, to my understanding, I'm not sure if that was the first location of Atelier Lac, but to my understanding, Atelier Lac was originally based on top of a bookstore. Is that correct?
Well, that was really not Atelier Lac at that time.
I see.
It
I
was
see.
just one room that he rented where he sort of started to teach, but it only lasted a few months, and then actually it was over a drugstore. And would you believe a fire started in the drugstore,
Wow.
and so Richard was burnt out of that space.
That's incredible. So
It's
actually,
like,
so two fires occurred.
yeah, this was in the early days, like in 70, and then in 75 the other fire occurred.
Sure, sure.
And
Now,
from 75 then till 94,
mhm,
we were at a location that was very spacious and very helpful.
I see. Sure. So after that fire occurred, Mr. Lack was able to successfully renovate the school and get it back into working order.
Not the same building. He was in another. He found the building.
Okay,
It was actually nearby. It was kitty corner from where the burnt out building was.
I see. So in total, how many moves did Atelier Lack have in its duration?
How many rooms?
How many different locations did it have?
Well, this was the one at Hennepin Lake.
Mm-hmm.
It lasted from 75 till 94.
I see. Okay.
So it was 19 years.
Right. Wow. Okay.
And the owner was an old Greek gentleman
I see.
who was very amenable to low rent, and he was happy that we were there. It was an
Sure.
empty space for him. And he passed away in 94
I see. Okay.
or 93. And then the people who had the space afterwards wanted to raise the rent really astronomically,
Okay.
and they had to move. By that time, Richard was retired,
I see.
and Sid Vicker and Dale Redpath ran the
That's
atelier,
right.
and they had to move. So,
So throughout its
and they're still at the other location.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Catherine?
So that was sort of the third location where
Yeah,
they're
the
right.
third location. Yeah, that's interesting. So you had three moves during the actual life of the school.
Yes, well, 2, 3.
Interesting. That's really, really interesting. Now, I have read that Atelier Lac received some harsh criticism from proponents of modernism. Did you find that this had an impact on Mr. Lac?
Well, he was very angry most of the time. He couldn't deal with that. He said, people just don't understand.
Of course.
And he wasn't paranoid, but he felt that he would have had every right to be,
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
because he was really, and his students, they were really maligned. I mean, they were not treated well.
Yes, I've heard that. I've heard that.
I think Annette would have told you a story about that. She had a very bad experience. She was teaching.
Hmm.
I don't know if she told you about that.
Not to my knowledge, no.
She was teaching at the Art Institute. She was teaching children.
I see.
And one morning, and it was very successful, and the children were happy and they were learning things. And it was a Saturday class.
I see.
And Saturday she went down there and they asked her to leave. And she said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, we found out that you're associated with Richard Lack and we don't want you to teach here."
That's right. She did mention that. That's correct. Yep, that's right. That's interesting. So
That's one example.
that's incredibly harsh. So
It was.
what form did the criticism take, and I suppose how did Mr. Lack respond to it? So was it mainly verbal, or were there writings in newspaper articles and such?
Well, he didn't really respond.
I see.
You know, he kept doing what he was doing
Right.
in spite of the not very friendly atmosphere.
Yes. Yeah.
And the students had to learn to live with that.
Of course. Yeah. And to my knowledge, in another story, Mr. Lack and his students had exhibited work in a particular context, and from what I recall from memory, some of that work was actually vandalized by the public. Is that correct?
It was at a junior college. It was a few drawings that were exhibited,
Yeah.
and we don't know who vandalized or why.
Okay.
I don't think they had enough security, and there were always people who resisted good drawing because they were afraid. Really, they were afraid for their jobs.
Of course.
Because
Yes.
they had to teach in art schools, but they didn't know how to teach good drawing.
Absolutely.
They didn't want to value that.
That's right. That's right. So at this point in time, what are we talking? What year was it roughly?
This was right at the beginning, maybe in 72, 73.
72, 73.
The vandalized, yeah.
That's really interesting. Now, can you tell me, just so our listeners can get a bit of an idea, how strong was modernism's influence during this time?
Well, there was no other influence. In Minneapolis, it was all, that was all that there was
Yeah, of course.
in the public eye.
Yes, yes.
Nobody knew that there is any other art these days or those days.
Of course. It was basically all there was. There was no real place to turn to receive a traditional training.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, also, basically, people didn't even know about that there is a way to train and to paint differently.
Of course, yes.
I figured that was all 19th century and nobody knew anymore how to do it. That's one reason Richard was so seriously sticking to his course of action. He felt that he had to provide a link
Of course.
from the knowledge that was getting lost.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So he was really, and that's one reason he studied the old masters so much, because already a lot of the methods were lost.
That's right. That's right.
He had to rediscover a lot of it.
That's right.
And we found out, I personally found out later, I think he did too, there were some other people who were working in the same direction, but nobody knew about each other.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that in Minneapolis?
Well, I'm not sure it was Minneapolis, but around the country, there were a couple people who tried to do the same thing, but they didn't even know about each other.
That's fascinating. That's really fascinating. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
Okay, moving forward. Now, I understand that due to fallouts with students and financial pressures, there were times when Mr. Lack considered leaving his teaching duties to focus solely on painting. What do you think kept him going during these times of discontent?
I guess reading Jung
Yes, okay.
and the music he did,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, everybody goes through different changes in life,
Of
different
course.
personality changes, and different energy changes.
Sure.
So he just had a darker time, and then, but he did work all the time, and the discipline carried him through.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So none of that pressure affected his time in the studio painting.
If it did, it was not visible.
I see. I see.
He probably spent more time contemplating things and less painting, but mostly he just stuck to his painting.
Great. Great. What discipline. That's just incredible. Now, do you think he felt an obligation to continue Gamble's work and therefore didn't want to let him down? That's why he kept essentially kept the school running?
He the fact that the feeling that he might let Gamble down had nothing to do with it.
Is that right?
No, Richard believed that he was carrying on something very important that would be lost if some people didn't carry it on.
Of course, of course. That's a good enough reason to keep the school running. Now, moving forward, in 1982, Mr. Lack coined the term classical realism to differentiate the realism of the Boston School from that of other representational artists. Today, the term has fallen into general usage to describe the work of artists who have trained in an atelier. How would you describe the principles and philosophies that underpin classical realism?
You know, that's really not for me to do. I think Steve probably explained it better. It just had to be differentiated because they had photorealism,
Of course.
which was, people would say, oh, it's a pretty landscape, but I can just take a photograph,
Yes.
and get the same thing. And I often suggested that they take a photograph of he and Don Kestner take photographs of their subject and blow it up and set it side by side with their paintings and
Interesting.
just show people the difference. And they never did it. I wish they had,
Okay, that's interesting.
because people actually didn't understand what
Yes,
went into a painting.
sure, sure. Would Richard often talk to you about the philosophy or the ideas that underpin classical realism?
Well, classical realism is just a label. We had to call it something. I knew what he was trying to do is work in the academic tradition of skill and craft and use the impressionist idea of light and color.
Absolutely. Yes, that's correct. Now, is it fair to say that in order for one to be a classical realist, one must have a good heart?
You've talked to Annette too long. No, it really, Annette is a sweetheart, and she has the right ideas about many things. I think personally that heart is just as important as discipline and understanding, intelligence, energy to move forward, perseverance, hard work, whatever you want to call it. I mean, without heart, it becomes maybe cold and meaningless, but with just heart, you wouldn't get it done.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. That's a good description there, Catherine. Today, do you believe classical realism has become adulterated?
Well, that's not for me to say. I really don't know. I do think that there are people, at least in our school and maybe in others too, who have very strict disciplines and they are trying their best to paint beautiful paintings. That's really all it is about. It's not about the label, it's about the final product.
Of course.
That's how I look at it. And
Lovely. Very nice. Now, how do you feel about other schools using the term when in fact the qualities present in the student's work is not what Mr. Lack intended the term to mean?
you know, you have no control over what other people do
That's right.
and what they use and how they use it. He used to say that, these people are not really trained, but they're beginning to teach in small towns and everything. I said, there's nothing you can do about that. You're teaching a language and a knowledge, a craft. You have no control over what people are doing with it.
That's right.
So you
That's
have to
interesting.
accept that.
That's right. It's great that you were able to give him that kind of perspective as well. Now,
Well,
sorry, go on.
you have to have a certain perspective. You can't be insular.
That's right. That's right. Good. Now, in the spring of 1985, Atelier Lac began publishing Classical Realism Quarterly. Can you explain the genesis of this publication?
Richard had a student named Don Hoekstra,
Okay.
and he came from a college background, and he decided, we have to have a newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it started.
Interesting. So, what was the actual publication concerning? What was it going to be focused on?
I really wasn't part of it.
I see. I see.
I helped facilitate it, with the printing and all that, but I wasn't really part of it.
Okay.
I know occasionally they wanted to have anecdotes, and they wanted certainly to have some news about art.
Mm-hmm.
It ended up, after many years, with the Classical Realism Journal,
That's right.
and Steve Jurtson went to France to photograph some murals that have never been photographed before, or
That's right.
something similar. So it ended up on a very high note.
Of course. Yes.
And all the way through, a lot of people appreciated it, and it reached a lot of people. And so a lot of the articles were useful and helpful and informative. I did not have much to do with it.
Sure. Now, was the publication just sold at Atelier Lac? I mean, how was it disseminated?
Well, we had a mailing list,
I see.
and people would actually subscribe.
Great, great.
So it was kind of like that. It was very much a private publication, and it didn't make any money. It just it was all done by volunteers.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
All the writing and all the computer work.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we had to pay money when we wanted to illustrate with a painting that was owned by a museum. We had
That's
to
right.
ask permission,
Of course.
but not very often.
Sure, sure. That's really interesting to hear your actual explanation of how the publication came to be. Now, from other artists that are of Mr. Lac's lineage, I've come to understand that the publication took much time away from focusing on painting. And how did Mr. Lac feel about this?
I think it took as much time as people wanted to take away from painting.
Okay.
They wanted to write important articles. Well, it didn't have to be done at the expense of painting.
Sure, sure. Okay. Now I understand that Mr. Lac did contribute articles and certain essays to the publication, but at some point did he need to take a step back from that and just focus solely on painting?
Well, he always enjoyed doing some writing, and he wrote some articles that he enjoyed writing and some that he thought should be written. No, he enjoyed writing, but it didn't take that long.
Okay, great, interesting. Now, I've touched on my next question a little bit already, however, I'd like to restate it. Now, I understand that Mr. Lac was raised in a Lutheran church, but would come to reject its teachings. He became fascinated with the work of the Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung, and many Jungian ideas were adopted into Mr. Lac's paintings. Why was Mr. Lac so fascinated by the work of Jung?
Well, I told you earlier, I think his worldview harmonized with Jung's worldview.
Of course, yes.
Just he just understood after he read. Jung made a remark about the metamorphosis of the gods
Okay.
in one of his books. So Richard painted a painting, The Metamorphosis of the Gods.
Yes. Yep, that's right.
And it was maybe it was ahead of his time. Jung was certainly ahead of his time.
Mm-hmm.
And it certainly is taking place today, and it took place for the last 50 years.
Sure.
That these ideas about all sorts of things are changing totally.
Yes, absolutely.
And with the inclusion of the Oriental way of thinking and looking at the world, and then with the inclusion of the African mentality, we didn't have that in the early or in the mid 20th century, not like we have today.
Yes, absolutely.
So that was all included in all the change. And that's what happened to not just Richard, but most people.
Yes. Okay, that's interesting. That's very fascinating. So just to clarify, Catherine, did at any point throughout your life did Mr. Lack attend church?
No.
No. Okay, interesting. Now, moving forward, throughout his life, Mr. Lack was a successful portrait artist and painted many distinguishable people. In particular, on one late evening in the fall of 1989, Mr. Lack received a phone call from London, England. It was Michael Wilmot, the future 6th Baronet Italy Wilmot, who wanted Mr. Lack to paint a portrait of his wife Diana. The following year, Mr. Wilmot invited you and Mr. Lack to London to stay in their flat in Kensington near Holland Park while the portrait was being painted. Now, this was quite a commission for Mr. Lack, as historically the Wilmots have been painted by the likes of Sir Joshua Reynolds and Sir Godfrey Kneller, two of the greatest portraitists of the 18th century. Was Mr. Lack feeling at all apprehensive about painting the portrait?
No.
Okay.
No, he was very happy to get the commission, but no, he just was happy to paint it. He was anxious about whether there is enough light in the area where they had a sort of studio space. But he set it up by a window and everything worked out pretty well.
Fascinating. Now, what was your experience of this adventure going to London?
Well, we have been to London the year before and enjoyed some of the sights. And when we went to London for this 2-month stay, it wasn't even 2 months, maybe 6 weeks. Well, we lived there, and it was just, again, we established a routine.
Yes.
When Diana had time to pose, she would come and pose, and the other times Richard would paint on the dress and whatever else.
Yes.
Surroundings. And when Diana and Michael went away for a weekend maybe or something, then we took side trips. We went to Cambridge, we went to Bath. Mm-hmm. Afterwards, we took a little trip around the country.
Fantastic, lovely. Now, how many sittings did that portrait of Diana take?
Well, Richard always required 10 to 12 sittings.
Okay.
He told people right in the beginning, that's what I require, and they take about, 3-4 hours each time.
Sure.
20 minutes and then 10 minutes rest, and 20 minutes and 10 minutes rest. That was a established discipline. I don't remember how many sittings it took to paint Diana.
Okay. That's fine.
I imagine 10.
About 10, yep. Okay. Now, I know it might be a hard question to answer, but roughly how long would a portrait take, how many hours would a portrait take Mr. Lack to complete?
Well, it really depends on the portrait.
Of course.
Some of them were just busts, just head and shoulders, and of course they wouldn't take that much. Then he had a couple paintings that were 3/4 portraits, and then he painted a couple of full-length portraits.
Yes.
One of them was of my daughter.
That's right.
The other was of a doctor, and that took longer.
Sure. Yes, of course. Now, during the model breaks, what would Mr. Lack talk to his models about?
That I don't know. It depends on the models.
Okay,
It depends on the sitters.
of
But he
course.
always had an interesting time because he had pretty interesting sitters, mostly doctors, lawyers, professors, and he had a couple governors.
Wow.
In fact, one of the governors, and I shouldn't say this, Richard told me he's a real lawyer. He won't say a word. So he couldn't have a conversation.
That's an interesting anecdote. Okay. Going back to Mr. Lack's teachings, now, do you believe that teaching provided him with an outlet? For instance, was teaching good for Mr. Lack as it would require him to get out of solitude of working in his studio and have healthy human contact?
Oh, I think he enjoyed it. I think he also was a very good teacher, which just shows now that all the students have developed and did all, and they all remember him as an excellent teacher and interesting and a lot of had a lot to offer.
Of course, of course.
I think it was good for Richard to get out naturally, but he would have gotten out anyway. He would have gotten out to do other things if he needed to. He used to take trips for landscape painting.
Yes. Interesting. Okay. So moving forward, now, Mr. Lack retired from teaching in 1992 due to failing health. Can you explain a little about the final years of Mr. Lack's teaching? For instance, would he often talk about the importance of keeping the school going once he was gone?
No, he knew that Sid and Dale were going to carry on, and he was very pleased. But but the nature of his illness was such that he lost interest.
Okay, that's interesting. So he actually lost interest in the school or in painting?
Well, he didn't lose interest, but he was diagnosed with a brain tumor.
Yes.
So for about a year, he was really just scared, I think.
Okay.
And then slowly, because of the brain tumor, the nature of the brain tumor, his hormone level was low,
I see.
even though it was artificially replaced. And that never got better.
I
It
see.
just got worse. He lost his energy.
I see. I see. And that's completely understandable.
His joie de vivre, let's say.
Yes. Yep. Yep. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned that Sid Wicker and Dale Redpath, Mr. Lack knew that Sid Wicker and Dale Redpath would take over the school. Was that something that he agreed upon with them?
I worked with him for 2 years,
Oh,
from 92 to 94.
I see.
And he knew that they were going to carry on, yes.
Great. So eventually, in time, Sid Wicker and Dale Redpath took over Atelier Lack. They moved it to a different location and changed its name to The Atelier. What is your opinion of the school today?
I think it's fantastic. They do a fabulous job. They have lots and lots of people who respond to the school. They come, they want to study, and they do study. They have lots of evening classes, and they also establish some daytime classes. They're doing very, very well, except for one thing. Last year, Dale Redpath had a stroke.
That's right. So I understand he's away from teaching now. Is that correct?
She cannot teach anymore. So, but there are 4 or 5 excellent teachers that they have raised, they have educated, they have trained.
Sure.
And they are very dedicated, and the atelier seems to be doing really well.
Fantastic. That's great to hear.
Well, it's sad because they are raising the rent so high they may not be able to stay there.
Is that right?
And it just happened last year, and it's very tragic. So now they're all engaged in fundraising.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Well, they need to. You can't charge the students very much money because what you want, and this is the philosophy of an atelier, what you want is talented people.
Of course.
And don't always have any means to study. So you have to keep it within reason how much money they can pay.
Of course. Yes.
So everybody is partly on a volunteer trip.
Yeah. Yeah. Has the school actually found someone to replace Dale Redpath?
They have several people. Yes.
Okay.
Her name is Laura Tondell. She has studied for 5 years. She's a painter. She's been teaching ever since in the part-time classes and also with the full-time group.
Fantastic. That's great to hear. Very, very
And she's
pleased.
very interested in doing it, carrying it on. They have several people who are working now that in the beginning wasn't needed, but now they have lots of people. They have people who help put out the brochure and run the mailing list and keep on top of all the things that need to be paid attention to.
Sure. Great. So it sounds like a really a kind of a group effort to keep the school running. Is that right?
Yes, and I tell Sid it sounds almost like a business.
So, Katherine, can you just explain to me, in Minnesota right now, is Atelier Lac a fairly well-known art school?
I think they know. I think a lot of people know because they get a lot of people to apply for full-time study, not necessarily from Minnesota, but all over.
That's right. Sure.
And there is a student, Jeff Larson,
Yes.
who was one of Richard's students, and he opened a school in Duluth
That's
last
right.
week,
Yep.
which was really a beautiful area and beautiful school.
Absolutely.
And they're doing a super job starting to train students. So
That's right. And
people
sorry, go
have
on.
opportunities now
That's
in
right.
Minnesota and other places, of course.
Absolutely. And I'll just like to acknowledge as well, that's Jeffrey Larson and his son, Brock Larson, who have opened up the Great Lakes Academy in Duluth.
Right.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, sure. Now, in regards to the atelier, has the curriculum changed since Mr. Lack's passing?
Which way?
Well, I suppose, is it still the same as it was back when it was Atelier Lack, or has the curriculum changed? Have the directors of the school added or adopted any different philosophy to the actual original teaching?
No, the training is the same.
Good.
The goal is the same. The focus is the same. They have expanded by helping with perspective, with special anatomy sessions.
Great.
Excuse me.
It's okay. That's great to hear, Catherine. So anatomy has been introduced to the curriculum and perspective study as well.
It's not a curriculum. It's just a class for one time.
I see. So
They have classes for. Oh, I don't know. Have you ever seen the brochure that they put up?
well, I've definitely seen their website. So it's essentially, from what I understand, it's almost a workshop.
Yeah, they have workshops. Actually, the workshops are very good for people who want to study full time. It gives them a flavor of what they are going to be facing as a full-time student.
Of course, yes. It's a great way to get a taste for the school's
Yes.
philosophy. Yes.
And some people come right into full-time if they're accepted
Great.
because they like what they get, and other people say, oh no, this is not what I want.
Of course. Great. Now, moving forward, Mr. Lack worked in every genre of Western art, including still life, portrait, indoor and outdoor genre, landscape, and imaginative painting. Is much of Mr. Lack's work in the permanent collection of museums?
Some of it is in museums, yes.
And now,
Not much.
Not
but
much. Okay. Now that's in Minnesota, museums in Minnesota?
There is none in Minnesota.
Oh, okay.
There
Interesting.
are some museums, and I don't know many. Mostly, he has quite a few works in the Maryhill Museum,
Yes, of course.
and he has a large exhibition there right now.
Absolutely. I was going to touch on that in a moment, actually. Uh, Now, in regards to selling Mr. Lack's work, have you been successful in moving much of his work?
Well, a lot of his work over the years was sold right out of the studio.
Yes.
In the beginning, he had a gentleman who owned a gallery in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Okay.
So he sent a lot of still lifes down there, and the gallery sold all of them at that
Wow.
time.
Interesting.
But after a while, the gallery changed into Western art.
I see. Yes.
It's interested anymore in his work. So
Interesting. Now, can you clarify something for me, Catherine? Now, Mr. Lack, to my understanding, referred to certain still lifes as pot boilers. Is that correct?
pot boilers, you know what it means.
What's that?
Well, it means that they keep the pot boiling. You earn enough to feed your family.
I see.
And he
Okay.
always said, it's over the years, over the centuries, it was called that, at least in the 19th century. That's what he told me. But he said, I might paint pot boilers, but it doesn't mean they have to be shoddy. They can be done perfectly, and they can be beautiful, and they can be done well. So it's each of them. When he called them pot boilers, he put all his knowledge and interest into it.
That's fascinating. So pot boilers actually has a historical connotation as well.
Well, yes, it just means that you paint some pictures that will sell easier than others anyway.
Specifically still life or any genre?
Well, still lives, yes, a lot of people will respond to still lives. They want something decorative in their house.
Yes.
It's easier to relate to. A lot of people say, I don't want any other people in my house except my family.
That's interesting, yeah.
For genre paintings, you have to understand a little more about paintings before you appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The imaginative paintings, generally, you have to really want the painting.
That's interesting. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, the imaginative paintings will appeal to something in you that is more like fantasy and fairy tale, and wishful thinking and expression of something you usually don't know how to express.
Of course. And it is challenging because obviously oftentimes what you're painting is not directly in front of you. It's from imagination.
Not at all. You have to think about it. You have to. Richard did many studies for his paintings, but how to put them together was entirely what he wanted to do. There was nothing there to begin with.
Yeah. To my understanding, the last genre of painting, which is the imaginative painting, was the culmination of the students' training. Is that correct?
The what?
The culmination, so almost like the last.
Yes.
Yeah.
I didn't quite get the yes. Well, that's really not every student aspires to that.
That's correct.
But those who do, they have all the basic knowledge to be able to do it well.
Of course. Of course. Yep.
We have a special. I always remember a student who was Sid and Dale's student. She's a nun.
Okay.
From Boston. And she is doing religious paintings that are done in a just perfect way, just like Steve is doing and like Richard did. I mean, she really picked up all the knowledge and the discipline. She's just really good.
Do you have her name, Catherine?
I know her name as Sister Laura.
Sister Laura.
I probably could look up his name. You could maybe check with the atelier. They have her name.
Sure, sure. Thank you for that, Catherine. Now, in regards to imaginative painting, would you say that in order for an artist to call themselves a classical realist, they must be creating imaginative painting?
I I think what they paint has nothing to do with it.
Okay,
It has nothing to do with the term classical realism. Classical realism seems to be just a style. It doesn't matter what you do with it.
that's interesting. Okay, so you're quite open on the idea of classical realism.
I I
Wow,
think it's the label, and I learned from a Jungian idea that when you put a label on something, you can't see the thing.
that's right. Yeah, that's interesting as well. Well, it really is surprising to hear that you are so open on the definition of classical realism. I didn't really expect that.
Well, I don't. I'm not for labels. I don't think classical realism you know, is given too much importance, but it needed to be there because of the differentiation from all the other things that people call realistic. This is a different approach to realism.
Of course, that's right. And that's something we need to obviously make clear.
Well, yes, you need to differentiate somehow from other things. You can say this is in a style that includes all this discipline from the past.
Hmm.
It's not
Interesting.
just photographic or whatever you think is representational.
Sure. Interesting that you mentioned photographic there. Now, what was Mr. Lack's opinion of using photographic aid in the painting process?
Well, it's no problem at all. You
Okay,
can use photographs and set up settings, whatever you want to do, but you don't have to paint from the photograph.
sure. Okay. So
We
is
had
it, go
I
on.
have to tell you this. We had a friend who was a curator of one of the art museums.
Yes.
And he came over and he saw the painting, A Mother and Child, when I was holding Peter.
Hmm.
And 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 he was open mouthed to look at it, and he said, "How do you do it?" He said, "Did you do a photograph and then project it onto the canvas and then paint it?" It's just an impossible idea, and how can anybody imagine that you can paint that way?
That's right. That's interesting.
You think about it.
That's right. That's right. Now, moving forward, what do you think Mr. Lack's reaction would be to how popularized atelier training has today become?
Well, I should think he would be pleased, but also you have to remember, and I probably hate to say this in today's world, but it's a little bit exclusive the way that teaching goes.
That's right.
And really not everybody is going to be able to follow in those footsteps.
That's correct. Sure. Sure. And we
But
definitely,
don't emphasize it.
absolutely.
It
And we,
it's just
sorry,
it's
go
just
on.
not it's just not politically correct.
Interesting. That's very interesting. And it's true that when we look at the contemporary atelier training, the schools that have developed, the majority of them have developed under the cultural surface. A lot of them are relatively unknown to the broader art community.
Well, you should be.
Hmm.
All the good things develop in darkness.
That's
You
interesting.
know, seeds are planted in the dark earth and then they develop into like oak trees and other things.
Lovely.
If that training becomes a matter of everyday occurrence, it's not going to have the depth.
Yes, that's an interesting point there, Catherine, as well. Fascinating. Now, you mentioned that the Maryhill Museum of Art has two current exhibitions of Mr. Lack's work. Now, I want to know what your opinion is of those exhibitions. Now, the first is titled Richard F. Lack, The Interior Journey, Paintings, Drawings, and Studies, and the second is titled American Classical Realism.
Well, it's the same exhibit.
Oh, it's the same exhibit, is that right?
Yes.
So they're not two separate exhibitions?
No.
They're combined?
No, he just had he has an exhibit of about 40 works of imaginary painting and studies.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is 5 large canvases of the interior journey, and another part is 3 large only 2 are shown, of the can't think of, anyway, the Armageddon, the I can't think of the word.
That's okay.
But the 3 large paintings that he did to start with the apocalypse.
I see, yes. Yeah, I know the ones you're talking about.
And then the large one in the middle, and then the final destruction.
Destruction, yes. That's
the
right.
first one and the last one are in the exhibit.
I see.
But the whole exhibit contains a lot of other paintings.
By Mr. Lack or his students?
Pardon?
Are they of Mr. Lack's work or of his students' work?
Oh, yes. No, it's all his work.
I see, right.
It's all imaginative work. It doesn't have anything to do with his portraits or other work.
Great.
Although he has some work in Maryhill that is an interior and portrait and a self-portrait, a landscape.
Sure. Great.
But they're not in the same exhibition. They're in their permanent collection.
Great. So they do own permanent work in the permanent collection of Mr. Lack.
Yes.
Great. Fantastic. That's good to hear. Now, how do you see Mr. Lack's legacy being carried forward?
Well, I can't believe how successful it is. I mean, it seems like I always liken it to a fountain that you start, all a narrow stream, and then it bursts open like a fan, or it's just amazing how it spreads.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems that the legacy is working.
Absolutely.
It's being carried.
Interesting. Now, you have 3 children with Mr. Lack. So Susanna, Michael, and Peter. Now, I understand that Susanna is a psychologist and Michael is a graphic designer. However, I'm unsure what Peter does.
Peter is a musician.
Oh, is that right?
He writes songs and he plays instruments and he plays in groups and he plays for entertainment. But he does have a day job. For about 20 years, he was a counselor at a halfway house.
Oh, I see. Lovely.
Right now he's not, but he still has a day job.
Now,
he lives in a retirement community.
I see.
And he has a very simple life. They raise a garden and they raise chickens and they have built their own house.
Interesting.
It's a very unusual little place where they live.
It sounds like a nice way for a creative person to live.
Yes. Well, they love it.
Great. That's great to hear. Now, are you all surprised at the impact that Mr. Lack and his legacy have had on the resurgence of traditional art?
I'm not surprised at all, because when you look at history, things go up and down and they change all the time. And, I don't think anything is static. People's opinions is another story, but generally change happens.
Interesting. Sure.
It's just my philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, in Minnesota at the moment, I mean, are the general public aware of who Richard Lack is?
Well, a few, yes. Those people who are interested in art. And especially, I'm going to tell you what I think about painting in today's world.
Please do.
Today's world is so full of noise and color and movement, and painting is a quiet art.
That's right.
You have to stand and look and let it work on you and enjoy it just for it what it is. It doesn't yell at you or anything. So I don't think it's a good time for painting.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
That's just my opinion. Don't even listen to it.
It's a good opinion. So do you believe that the current atelier movement is almost an antidote to the issues with contemporary art?
Well, I hope it is.
Yep. Interesting. Many would agree that it is. So I think
a lot of people are looking for something else. A lot of people are not involved in this noisy, bright, moving world, and so I think there are more and more people who respond to something more quiet and more real.
Sure, absolutely. Just getting towards my conclusion, Katherine, I just wanted to know, throughout his lifetime, what was Mr. Lack's opinion on modern art? Would he often talk about it, or did he just completely ignore it?
Well, one of his opinions was that because it rose to such importance, it destroyed a lot of knowledge about the craft of painting.
Of course.
And he didn't have very much opinion because he had too much. He had to spend too much time on focusing what he was doing.
Of course.
He couldn't be sidetracked all the time.
Absolutely. That's interesting. Now, in regards to anything that we've commented on in this interview, is there anything that you would like to revisit or touch on before we conclude?
No, but I want to thank you. I want to thank you for organizing it, for organizing all the questions and all that. It's very nice that you're doing this, and I wish you good luck.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Katherine. It's really been my pleasure. Would you like to provide your contact information so that listeners can contact you regarding anything we have discussed throughout the interview?
I am on email, but I usually don't even like to give that out.
Okay.
I have a phone number, and I don't do much else, nothing on social media.
That's fair enough. That's fine. Is there a particular website that you would like to recommend for listeners that may like to learn a little bit more about Mr. Lack and his life's work?
Well, I think you should try the Atelier's website. They have all sorts of information on there.
Absolutely. Great. That's fine. I'll mention that when I publish the interview as well. That's really, really fascinating. Do you find that there's many people that have reached out and made contact with you regarding Mr. Lack?
Over the years, on and off, yes. Not that many.
Okay, that's interesting.
I'm not too encouraging about being public.
I see. That's interesting. Right. Interesting. So, one thing I wanted to explain as well, I suppose one thing I wanted to get your opinion on rather is, are there any schools that you have regular contact with?
No.
No. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Katherine. It's really been incredible talking to you, and it has been a long time coming. And I have a little closing statement that I'd like to read out, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. So, Katherine, it has truly been a privilege talking with you today. I really appreciate you sharing your life experiences with Mr. Lack. Through listening to your answers, I've come to realize what an incredibly loving, generous, and dedicated husband, father, artist, and teacher Mr. Lack was. Although I never had the honor of meeting Mr. Lack myself, through the discussions that I've had with his former students, I've learnt that he had the capacity to deeply touch the lives of those who made contact with him. Many who trained with him professed that their lives would have been nothing if they hadn't met him. I believe he done more than just provide his students with the technical means to create fine drawings and edifying paintings. He also provided them with the ability to see, that is, the ability to understand that love, beauty, faith, family, nature, and skillful craftsmanship are relevant components to not only create masterful artworks, but to also live a fulfilled life. He had the heart to stand up to the relentless forces of modernism and show that there was another way. He cultivated a community of like-minded disciples and modelled to them a life of dignity and integrity. He gave us the gift of classical realism, and through it, his legacy will continue. I don't believe Mr. Lack would have been able to achieve all this if he didn't have your support throughout the journey. As quoted by Mr. Lack himself, "I was inspired by nature and the old masters. I attempted to paint the visible world and create a body of work that was personal, beautiful, and skillfully crafted. I painted what had meaning to me, my family and friends, the beauty of nature, and the inner life of the soul. Both by temperament and interest, I've explored a variety of subject matter from the contemporary world and from the world of imagination. I've led a privileged life. I have a wonderful wife and a marvelous family, and have been able to earn a living by doing what brought me joy. I've taught talented students and know many fine friends and supporters. To me, that's a successful life." End quote. Now, I doubt that I can top Mr. Lack's quote, so I guess I'll just leave it at that.
That's wonderful.
Thank you very much for your time today, Katherine.
Have a good life.
You too. Take care now.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.